Welcome, everyone. I'm Anna Marie Pavlik-Rosen, one of the board members, and I had contacted Keith Chasteen a while ago for his ideas for the budget, and thought this would be a good time to make a presentation and see what we can do to help pollinators and also reduce our budget for maintenance. I've always been interested in growing things, and when I was off at college, my first roommate joined a commune. And then I got my second roommate, who was a biology major. We were getting to know each other, and an insect walked across my desk, and I was ready to eliminate it. And she said, "Oh my gosh, no, you can't do that." And we had to capture it and take it outside. And I said, "Well, was it beneficial? Was it a special insect?" She said, "No, that's the whole point. It's all part of the web of life, and you have to accept all of them because they all form this web that creates larger animals and a nicer place to live." So that's was my early understanding of benefiting insects. So Keith is here. His background is forestry. He's been working with the Army Corps of Engineers for
about 17 years.
17 years, so I'll let him go ahead and talk about what they've been doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning. I appreciate y'all having me here. Just wanted to note that the presentation that I've put together is not the Corps of Engineers' official statements or policies or whatever. It's actually a lot of my opinions and my observations and experiences. As Anna Marie mentioned, my name's Keith Chasteen. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm a natural resources management specialist. I spent 13 years with the U.S. Forest Service as a forester. Forestry is my background, and have been with the Corps of Engineers about 17 years, working in natural resources management, which basically is dealing with the birds and the bees and the trees and the people. And I'll explain a little bit more of that here shortly. So just a little bit before I get into talking about habitat enhancement for pollinators, and especially some strategies to reduce mowing as well as providing other benefits. Just a little brief background on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, the Corps of Engineers is part of the Army. You notice I'm not in uniform. I'm a civilian. I'm not a soldier. We work closely with soldiers. In the Louisville District, our district commander is a colonel, and we have quite a few other folks that we call green suiters who are wearing the uniform. And the Corps of Engineers, our primary missions are both military as well as civil works. And within our military mission, we do a lot of things such as construction. The construction over the last 10 years or so at Fort Knox was all overseen and designed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We construct reserve centers across the U.S. as well as other things. We'll be involved in the VA hospital whenever that is determined where that's going to be in the Louisville area. I work on the civil works side. Within the civil works mission, we do a lot of things you may be familiar with if you've ever been to any of our lakes, like Taylorsville Lake, I think is probably the closest one. That's one of our flood control projects. We deal with navigation on the rivers, of course the Ohio River and other rivers throughout the U.S. We have regulatory within our mission, again, recreation, emergency management, and environmental stewardship. Now, I primarily work in the recreation and environmental stewardship realm, and so most of my discussion today is going to be focused on that. And it's within environmental stewardship and a combination of environmental stewardship and recreation is basically what we call our natural resource management program. But most of what I'm going to be talking about today is revolved around our environmental stewardship program, dealing with the vegetation, the land base that we manage, as well as the water base, the fisheries, and that sort of thing. So across the U.S., the Corps of Engineers has 256 water resources projects in 43 different states, and we manage over 12 million acres of lands and waters. And we are the leading water-based recreation provider of all the federal agencies. And then within our environmental stewardship program, our mission is to manage and conserve natural resources in within an ecosystem management realm to provide quality public outdoor recreation experiences and to serve the needs of present and future generations. So even within our natural resource, our environmental stewardship program, a lot of the focus is recreation. And because we are a water-based, or have a lot of water-based recreation, I do have to throw in a water safety message. If you're going to be in, on, or near the water, regardless of what water body that is, please wear a life jacket or some sort of life preserver. Within the Louisville District, both in 2015 and 2016, we had 7 drownings within our district. And of all the 14 of those incidences, none of them were wearing a life jacket. So please give that strong consideration for yourself and your family and your friends when you're on, in, or near the water. Now, I keep talking about the Louisville District. The Louisville District consists primarily, this is our Civil Works District. We're looking at southeastern Illinois, much of Kentucky, southwestern Ohio, and most of Indiana. That's the district that I work in, the Louisville District. And within that district, we have 20 flood control projects, or lakes, reservoirs. We also have 10 locks and dams on the Ohio and Green Rivers. And then we also have the only National Wildlife Conservation Area within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and that's Fallsy, Ohio, in Louisville, basically. Now, Olmsted Locks and Dam, way down in southern Illinois, is not completed. It's actually a construction project right now. But once it goes into operation within the next few years, then it will make Lock and Dam 52 and 53 obsolete, and they will be decommissioned. So then at that time, we'll have 9 locks and dams. And on the Kentucky River, there are a couple locks, which are Corps of Engineers property. However, those are leased out to the state and managed by the state, primarily for recreational use. So just kind of general background, as I mentioned previously, we strive to manage resources for future generations. Like most governmental organizations and private organizations, our budgets continue to be flat or actually declining. We maybe get the same amount of money, but with inflation, basically we have declining budgets that we have to work with. And then the Corps of Engineers as an agency is aware that pollinators are really being heavily impacted. Their populations are on the decline, whether that be, you may hear about colony collapse of European honeybees. We have around 4,000 native bees in the U.S., which indications are populations are declining as well. And then butterflies, one well-known instance of decline is the monarch butterfly, where populations have declined by about 90% in the last 15 years. And then as we manage our lands, we identify areas to potentially reduce our mowing footprint. Now, this has occurred a lot at our lakes, where our lakes have natural resource management staff. However, at our 10 locks and dams, that has not really been looked at all that much because we do not have natural resource management staff currently at our locks. So our mowing within the Louisville District primarily is to maintain recreational areas and activities, site management at the locks. The lock operators like to have a view of the river, both upriver and downriver, in order to see what tows are coming, what the backup is, that sort of thing. Also, anytime that there's some sort of major reconstruction, quite often a fairly large area is needed just to station equipment, station materials, supplies, that sort of thing. Our locks are big. When you're holding back the Ohio River and basically running tows, barges through that system and holding back that water and raising the water, lowering the water, it's a very big structure. And so to repair that structure, it typically takes a pretty large space. And then just maintaining our facility footprint, we, as a neighbor, need to maintain our property, maintain our property lines, know where our property is so that we're not encroaching on our neighbors, nor are we allowing our neighbors to encroach on us. So really that's primarily the reason that we mow our lands. And when I ask, especially our lock masters who manage the locks, so why do you mow this big area? A lot of times the answer is, well, because we've always mowed it. And then little thought overall has been put into the effects that our mowing does on the habitat. Just this is what we've always done, so we really haven't thought of that area being any different than it is. And actually our mowing in itself can create management challenges. And I don't mean just the cost of the actual mowing, but quite often an openly mowed area is very appealing to the individual who wants to operate his vehicle illegally off the designated roadway, versus if it's in a higher vegetative state, then it's not as appealing because you can't see if there's holes or ditches or logs. And so quite often where we get off-road vehicle use, it's in our mowed areas because you can see it looks so enticing to get your truck out there, and we don't allow that, but it does occur. Also, Canada geese. I had one of our lock masters contact me. Keith, what can we do? We are getting so many resident Canada geese, and they're leaving the droppings all over the picnic area. We just can't keep them out of there. And I told this individual, I said, well, we probably need to give you an award for being the best Canada goose manager in the district because you have created perfect habitat. Having this mowed lawn right up to the edge of the water is exactly what they want. I said, let it grow up a little bit. Plant some shrubs, break up that visual openness that the geese have where they can feel safe and avoid predators. Well, we're not there yet, but he's thinking about it. So, knowing things such as that we could manage things differently, and knowing the plight or the current condition of the pollinators, at a lot of our lakes who have that natural resource management staff, over the years they have looked at reducing the mowed areas and actually converting those areas to native plants, grasses, forbs, pollinator plants. But that hasn't happened everywhere, such as at the locks. Well, in 2014, there was a presidential memorandum basically directing federal agencies to look at developing a strategy for promoting the health of honeybees and other pollinators. And one thing that was kind of interesting from a Corps of Engineers standpoint with this memo was that it actually identified the Corps of Engineers and our 12 million acres and indicated that we shall incorporate conservation practices for pollinator habitat at these projects as appropriate. Typically, the Corps of Engineers is lumped in either with regular Army or with DOD, and so it was unique that we were identified as our own standing agency, land management agency. So this memo came out, directed the creation of this policy, and that was actually created in May of 2015. The strategy actually came out, and it still indicated the Corps of Engineers as a land manager that shall promote management for pollinators where appropriate. And so from that kind of gave me the idea, okay, here's the opportunity. We have all these mowed areas just because we've always done it, where we can potentially convert those to beneficial habitat for pollinators. And so the winter of 2015, 2016, I created a district mowing for pollinators standard operating procedure, which was signed by the Chief of Operations. And what this did is it created basically direction to improve pollinator habitat within our mowed areas and provided guidance that it would be okay to mow less, potentially. And then also it helped the project managers to kind of think differently in the way that they did their day-to-day operations, such as because the grass is 8 inches tall, we need to get out there and mow it. Well, maybe you don't have to. And I do have a few copies of this SOP if anyone's interested, or I can email it to you. And at the end, I do provide my email address. Basically, it's just a guide based on what's there, timing of mowing, the fact that you don't necessarily have to mow an area every week, every month, or even every year. Maybe it would suffice just to mow it once every 3 years. And so I sent this SOP out and encouraged folks to look at their areas, and we began finding some opportunities. And there's different ways to maybe stop mowing or reduce mowing to benefit pollinators. And one way is just kind of in a passive method, just let the grass grow and see what happens. And then another way would be more proactive actions, whether it be planting, interplanting, or maybe eliminating that existing fescue or whatever the case may be and converting it to native plants. And so a few examples at Smith and Loxon Dam, which is just between Illinois and Kentucky, just upriver a little bit from Paducah. And actually the Illinois state line runs right through the project. We identified a little over 30 acres that historically had been maintained in a somewhat mowed state. And when I asked the lockmaster, well, why are you constantly mowing these areas? His response was out of concern of black locust trees that come in. They were kind of the first trees that would come in, get the big long thorns, and then when they can finally get out and mow the area, then they're repairing tractor tires because of the black locust. And I said, well, we could address the black locust specifically, and maybe even do that by shading them out, by planting other trees and that sort of thing. But they want to kind of maintain it in an open state where if they do have a major repair, then they may utilize that entire area just for again, storing, having equipment, that sort of thing. And so the lockmaster, after we visited, he started looking at the area and started changing the way they were doing things. And almost immediately, the site began to change as well. And for example, common milkweed came up all over the place. And it was probably always there before anyways, and then once they stopped mowing, then it finally was able to grow and begin to flower. And the change not only is just in the vegetation by not mowing it all the time, but just in the recognition by those operators on site saying, well, that's milkweed. I know that's beneficial to pollinators and to monarch butterflies. And not just common milkweed began showing up, but other milkweed species, including butterfly milkweed and swamp milkweed. And then also the staff there began sending me photos. Well, they were seeing all these things flittering around called butterflies, and such as the photo in the lower corner, he said these black butterflies are everywhere. Well, those are swallowtails on that swamp milkweed. And then they also began identifying and recognizing monarch butterflies. Well, monarchs are somewhat of an indicator species of how things are. As I mentioned, they've declined around 90% over the last 15 years. They are a very incredible insect, whereas they migrate each year they winter down in Mexico, and then actually there's about a 3,000-mile journey back up to southern Canada that some of them make, where they begin finding the milkweed, laying their eggs. Then as the eggs, the larvae grow and eventually become a butterfly, then they lay additional eggs. And then that third or fourth generation actually returns back down to Mexico to overwinter. And milkweed is the only species that the larvae can survive on for the monarch butterfly, and that's the importance of milkweed. Plus, it's a great nectaring plant. If you have any species of milkweed growing, not only will the monarchs find it, but also bumblebees, other native bees, and European honeybees, as well as other insects. So at Smithland, they started doing things a little bit differently. Didn't really have to do anything except step back. And it's getting to the point of concern. Well, y'all still need to maintain your edges, because when the trees start creeping back in, you may want to be on top of it, or else you'll be fighting the thorns again. And so that's just kind of an example of some passive management. Just by doing things a little bit differently, then you can have benefits immediately. But we've also have done some proactive management, and another example of that is at McAlpin Locks and Dam, which are located basically in downtown Louisville, right outside of the Portland neighborhood. And what we looked at McAlpin was the opportunity to enhance existing habitat, but also there were some areas that we wanted to actually convert to native species, often called meadows or prairies. And then being right in downtown Louisville, we wanted to be sure and include some public education and share the understanding. We're not just growing weeds now where we used to mow. We are actually producing habitat. And then also, as I mentioned, the constant or declining budgets. We just don't necessarily have money to be out there doing a lot of planting, a lot of site prep. And so we saw an opportunity to maybe involve the public to get some help through volunteerism in accomplishing some of the things that we identified that we'd like to do. So at McAlpin, again, it's downtown Louisville. We have a visitor area, and I'll just point to it real quick. Right here's an interpretive area and then an overlook. An overlook area where the public can go and watch the locking process. And then across on this island, which is Shippingport Island, is our maintenance area and offices. Well, we looked at all this area that was constantly mowed and identified just a little over 11 acres that we felt that we wanted to do something with. Some areas we wanted to continue to maintain because they are utilized for other uses. And so of the 11 acres that we identified, and I actually had to go through the environmental, the NEPA process, environmental review process, these areas were cleared to actually convert to pollinator habitat. And so we started off with what we call Area A, which is right in front of the overlook area, the interpretive area. And it's kind of unique. It's a fairly steep slope that runs along the lock chamber and very difficult to mow. It has a fence at the bottom of the slope. And so with the equipment that we have there, they really couldn't use the tractor because it would literally, if there's any moisture, it would slide down and end up against the fence, and then is a real pain to get it untangled from the fence. So this acre and a half basically was all labor with weed eaters. And when it came mowing time on this slope, I guarantee you no one was very excited, especially in July and August. And so what you have basically is a barren slope, little to no habitat benefits. And so this is the area that we looked at. And what we were looking at doing with this area, because of the slope, we didn't want to herbicide it, eliminate the existing vegetation, because we were afraid about the time we did that, the rain would come and we'd have a lot of erosion. So we didn't want to do that. And so rather than converting this site to native plants, we just want to look at enhancing it, enhancing the existing vegetation. And so, of course, we wanted to provide both nectar and host plants for various species. And with our limited budgets, we wanted to complete this effort at as low of a cost as possible. And so what we decided to do was to grow our own plants and then develop an event as an opportunity for volunteers to come and help plant them. And then also we wanted to find some partners who might be able to help. And so we did, in fact, grow our own plants. We set up a grow room in an empty office, just slapped together some 2x4s to hang some grow lights off of. And we did put plastic on the floor so that we wouldn't end up ruining the carpet. And most of the seed was either donated or collected by myself. One of our lakes that has a pollinator garden sent some seed to us. and we ended up with fairly decent success. Now, Dewey Casey, the lockmaster, he pretty much was in charge of making sure the plants were watered. He either did it himself or had one of his employees do it. He maintained or monitoring the temperature in the grow room, and then also the humidity, because we didn't want to have too much humidity and end up creating a mold problem in this office space. And so we ended up successfully growing about 650 plants. Originally, we attempted a little over 1,000, like 1,050, but just our inexperience, improper stratification of the seed, we only ended up with about 650. And so we did, the project did find some money, and felt they could utilize some of their operations money where they will not be mowing it. And so with that savings, they did purchase some additional plants, and we ended up having an event to get them planted. And so on May 14th, 2016, a little flyer was made up beforehand and put out into the local community. We actually got some free press with the local newspaper. The local NPR station came out and did an interview, and also a local television station did an interview, but all prior to the event. And so basically that was a little bit of free advertising. Some of these were placed at local businesses, at the local library branch, as well as other places targeted, the garden club, that sort of thing, some targeted audiences. And then we also got some help from some other folks who were interested, and so to make it more of an event rather than just a planting, some folks came out to set up booths. Fallsy Ohio State Park had a booth. The local bee club had a booth. The Corps of Engineers had a water safety table, as well as others. And then what I believe was the big attraction was a free lunch, free barbecue lunch. And LG&E, the Louisville Gas and Electric, which has a hydroelectric power plant right there on Shippingport Island, they donated meat for a barbecue lunch and other food. And then Dewey Casey, not only is he an exceptional lockmaster, but he is an exceptional barbecue expert. And so he made the meat that fed all of the volunteers. And then Greenway Landscape Services, a local landscaping company, they volunteered their time and equipment and actually came in and cleared the hillside off prior to the event. So that really was very helpful. And like the best made plans, May 14th came, and it was a cold, rainy morning. But luckily the rain stopped right before the event was to start. But then that's when the wind started, so it was a cold, windy day rather than a cold, rainy day. But in spite of that, we had over 100 people show up who were very excited to help, to learn about pollinators. And after a brief welcome and explanation of how the planting process is going to take place, as well as a safety message, then we broke folks up into groups and the planting began. And I don't know if everyone was so enthusiastic to be planting or they were just so cold they wanted to be doing something. At any rate, it worked out. We got about 1,200 plants into the ground. They were planted at a spacing of about 17 feet by 17 feet in groups of 3. So clusters are much more attractive to most pollinators than individual plants. And that's why we tried to cluster the plants, and then with the amount we had at about a 17 by 17 foot spacing. All ages helped out, and the hillside receive the plants. And hopefully some of the memories that were made will bring people back as they grow up to come out and check the area out, see what kind of benefits their efforts have made. And so that somewhat desert-like hillside has changed over time. And although this is just 1 year forward from the planting, the change is very obvious to me. And to me, the hillside is much more aesthetically appealing to me. There's flowers coming in. It's hard to see from this slide, but when you get down in the area and walk around, you can see a lot of different colors, a lot of different species that are successfully establishing on the site. And one thing with these native plants is typically the first year they're not going to do a whole lot because they're busy putting the root systems down. It'll be the second and third years when they'll really show a difference. But what's amazing is the amount of activity from pollinators of various species that are on the site right now, even as I speak. Well, the Area A was such a success that we moved on this last fall looking at a couple other areas. And so areas C and D, which added up to another 1.25 acres, rather than enhancing the existing vegetation, our goal with these sites was actually to replace that vegetation with native vegetation. We're currently a lot of fescue grass, a lot of non-native plants, many of which are beneficial to pollinators, but when they were mowed every week, they never really benefited much of anything. And so we did have these areas treated with herbicide to kill out the existing vegetation, and then they were planted last fall, and so now they are growing and actually, to me, visually look pretty nice. However, the site, there's still a lot of non-native species, and in hindsight, we should have done a little better job of eliminating that existing vegetation. But it's a learning process. But even then, I was out there a couple weeks ago and just all sorts of both native bees as well as honeybees, moths, butterflies, just all over the place. And this site will continue to improve. Moving down the river, again, a proactive opportunity we identified at Cannelton Locks and Dams near Cannelton, Indiana. So we're again in the river between Indiana and Kentucky. And Cannelton's a little different than McAlpin, where it's somewhat of a narrow lay of the land because of a bluff on the Indiana side, then the river itself, and Highway 62 running right along the project. And so we only were able to identify about 5 acres at Cannelton. And being new, and we have a new lockmaster there, he didn't want to jump right in and start doing things right along the highway where everybody'd see it. He said, why don't we start small? And so actually we identified this 0.18 acre area actually back behind our maintenance building as a start, which I was happy. A start is great, where he wanted to see how it went and then could move on from there before putting it out in front of the public. And so what we're doing at this site is converting it, but rather than using herbicide, which is very expensive, we are actually physically tilling the area. And so this is ongoing. So basically they tilled it, as it's recognized that things are starting to come back, they'll till it again. Do that throughout basically this entire growing season in hopes of, there's a lot of seed in the ground, and as you till it, then it's exposed to the sunlight and will go ahead and sprout. Well, if you do that often enough, eventually that seed bank runs out, and then once we put our native seed down, that'll be what comes up and will outcompete any of the other non-target species that do come in. So we'll be seeding this fall and seeing how it goes this spring or next spring. Now, one thing I want to note is the edge. Anytime you do something like this, I always highly recommend that you maintain your edge in a mowed state, whether it be an edge along the tree line or along a fence line, because if you don't do that, things are going to creep in, or if it's along a fence line, things will come in along your fence, and then you end up having to cut trees and brush out of your fence line. And so I always recommend that you do maintain fence lines and edges.
One question, what are you actually planting in there?
Well, this will be a seed mix of about 20 different species, consisting of both native grasses and native forbs. And if you'd like a copy of our seed mix, I'd be glad to send that to you. Now, you always don't have to go big. Sometimes you can look at smaller areas. At Car Creek Lake in eastern Kentucky, they have began looking at many of their recreation sites, such as this. This is a boat launch ramp area. There's a marina and picnic shelter in this area. And so, and these what I call islands in parking areas make great pollinator habitat. Now, to haul the tractor down there to mow that once a week is expensive. And so by converting it to pollinator habitat, it provides an opportunity to, again, provide that habitat, but also reduce that mowing footprint. And they're creating about 0.75 acres. They did create 0.75 acres this spring. The first year, you don't see a whole lot, but you get out in there and you can pick out the native plants, the target plants. And so you don't have to go big. You can do something very small. I have a very small area in my front yard that I've created. And at Buckhorn Lake, also in eastern Kentucky, at their campground entrance, used to be shrubs, grass, a lot of trimming of the shrubs and maintaining the grass. And so several years ago, they converted that to native plants, a pollinator area. And it still requires some maintenance, putting new mulch down in the spring, weeding in the spring, and then maybe cutting back the dead standing stems in the spring before they begin to grow again. But it has really created a lot of interest by the campers. They have some signage identifying what it is and why it is. And so even in a small area, you can produce a lot of benefits from both a maintenance standpoint, but also just from a habitat standpoint. And this is actually where some of our seed came from that we used at McAlpin last year. So if you let an area grow, a lot of this vegetation is 4 and 5 feet tall. Inevitably, somebody's going to say, why are you letting them weeds grow? Well, is it a weed patch? Well, it's not tall weeds, it's a pollinator area. But if you don't let people know that, they potentially will not know and will just see it as a bunch of weeds. And so it's important to strive to educate folks what exactly is going on, whether that be with interpretive displays, explaining what it is and why it is. Again, you should delineate your edges. You can put up no-mow signage indicating that it's not being mowed for a reason. And then also, social media, news releases, let people know what you're doing if you're making a change. If your neighbor across the fence suddenly sees a bunch of high weeds, they're going to complain. But if they know that it's a pollinator area and that their garden is going to be producing much more products than it ever has because of the pollination that will be occurring, well, suddenly it's not just a weed patch, it's providing those pollinators for the garden. And then also get others involved, whether it be garden clubs, scout groups, civic organizations, or even private entities. The more people who are involved, the more knowledge base there will be out there who will share your story in what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so there's lots of different types of signage available, whether it be such as the highway pollinator habitat zone signs that you see along the interstate, or if it's an actual interpretive panel that's produced telling the story of what's going on. Or something as simple as a no-mow zone. Well, why? Because we're providing a habitat, because we're raising pollinators. Okay, now y'all may be thinking, wow, he likes pollinators, the birds and the bees and that sort of thing. Growing the stuff, changing, providing that habitat. But I know some of you are maybe more interested, okay, well that's nice, but show me the money. How's this going to benefit us from a management standpoint? And I don't have all the ins and outs on that. There are actual upfront costs, especially for converting to like a native meadow. It's very expensive to apply herbicide and maybe multiple applications of herbicide to an area. The equipment and labor costs, if you do any tilling or even just the planting process itself, and then the seeds and plants are very expensive. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But really, if you look at it, that this short-term investment is going to produce long-term savings, that's where the true financial benefit is. And so I queried some of our folks, both within my district, but also within our entire region, to find out just different mowing costs. And a lot of our mowing, just because, again, budgets go down, we have to reduce where we can, so we reduce personnel in a lot of cases. So in a lot of locations, we do not do our own mowing, we contract it out. And so what I found out, I got estimates or current mowing cost of everywhere from close to $75 an acre to as low as almost $25 an acre. And of course, each year it goes up. But those are from some of our existing contracts. So if we just went with say an average $50 per acre, again, a contracted cost, to have your own labor do that, it may be more. You utilizing your own equipment, paying benefits, that sort of thing. But if it's $50 an acre, and typically our what we call our recreation season, when we do most of our mowing, say 24, 25, 26 weeks in length, and you pretty much need to do a weekly mowing anywhere here in Kentucky, Indiana, or else you'll have foot-high weeds, foot-high grass. At any rate, this gives us an average cost per acre of about $1,300 just to mow. Well, I mentioned the expense of the native seed. Well, for an acre, you're talking, and this just depending on the native seed mix that you obtain, but you're talking around $1,100 in seed per acre. And so that's almost it pretty much equals out. So what you save in the first year from mowing would cover the cost of the seed. However, you do have site prep costs. There is some establishment requirements for maintaining over the first and second year, such as high mowing. And so that second year, well, the first year you might have to mow every 2 or 3 weeks to get those native plants established and to not let the non-native plants go to seed. But then the second year, be fewer high mowing opportunities or needs, and then might need to do a little spot spraying if you have an area of a species that you don't want, such as an invasive species. But really by the third year, that site should basically be pretty well in your native plants at that time. Most of the native plants are bunch plants. If you only have one per square foot, it doesn't seem like you have much when they're just sprouting. But as they grow, and by the third year and are established, they'll be taking up 1.5 feet. And so suddenly they've crowded out everything else. And so basically by that third year, you would have little to no maintenance required. However, that doesn't mean the site is self-sustaining. And so it does need some sort of disturbance every 3 to 5 years so that those woodies that are starting to creep in, whether it be trees or shrubs, brush, as well as just setting back that existing vegetation so that it can all compete together. You need some sort of disturbance, whether that be mowing, haying, and really the preferred activity is prescribed burning. That's what that native vegetation has basically, through eons, become established with. And so a lot of your savings will be year 3 and beyond with some site maintenance. So that's basically with proactive type of management. Now, if you're looking at just passive management, let whatever's there go, then really you have immediate savings where you're not expending funds on that mowing activity. But don't look at it as total savings. Again, is it a weed patch or is it being done for a purpose? Maybe some of those funds that are freed up can be utilized to sign the area and to educate, whether it be your visitors or your neighbors or whatever the case may be. And again, it's not just a bunch of weeds. Now, there are opportunities for management of the areas, such as grants, and through entities such as Lowe's, Home Depot, they have environmental grant opportunities. Walmart has a community grant program. Often corporations will provide environmental grants to nonprofit organizations and to local governmental organizations. Get volunteers to do a lot of your work, garden clubs, and also private funding. There may be a local company that wants their name on that sign. And then, of course, there's non-financial benefits, which I've spoke about quite a bit, such as the improved habitat. There's this thing called carbon storage. The grasses and other plants that grow and die and remain on site and begin to break down going into the soil, that's storing the carbon. And then, of course, public relations, doing something good for the habitat, for the environment, that typically goes over very well. And then involving the public is a benefit. They begin to know your organizations and perhaps understand your organizations better, but also get to know you personally and are willing to help out however they can. And then also non-traditional recreational activities. And so I'm not talking about the ballpark or the picnic area, but now there's bird watching opportunities as you create this habitat, bug watching, butterfly photography, whatever the case may be. And then also just outdoor labs. Have the school bus come to your pollinator area. Help the kids to learn what's going on there and why it's important. And so to kind of finalize, one thing I like to say, and taking it from Field of Dreams, basically, Kevin Costner, plant it and they will come. And that really is the case. You get some pollinator plants out there and the insects will come. And so we'll go ahead and go to questions if anyone has questions. And I do want to provide my contact information in the event that you want to email me or call me if you think of something a little bit later on. By all means, feel free to contact me. So any questions that you might have?
McAlpin Lock and Dam there, that bank along there is fairly steep. You mentioned you decided not to fill it up or something like
Mhm.
that because of erosion.
Right.
I didn't catch how you did prepare it, or how you got rid of fescue, all that stuff like that.
Well, originally that site was planted in natives. However, it had gotten a lot of Johnson grass and thistle and other, a lot of purple clover, yellow clover, species that aren't native. However, on that site, even those provide habitat for pollinators. And so what we looked at doing was just to enhance that existing vegetation. So we left it in place and then interplanted to just kind of enhance that existing vegetation. And so, every time I go down there, because I always think more of the natives and see the Johnson grass or see the thistles or whatever, I think, oh, we need to spray that or we need to take care of that. Then I have to stand back. It's like, well, no, even though those aren't native, they are providing a purpose, whether it be just structural habitat. And that structural habitat, you have a tall grass next to, say, a forb. Well, a lot of times if that structure isn't there helping to hold that forb up, it'll just flop over. And so together, it all helps each other. And so, we left that existing vegetation in place and just enhanced it with some of the target native species. But there is big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, a few other natives that were already on site. And what we are finding is we're getting some tree recruitment on the site, sycamore, cottonwood, that sort of thing. And so now, probably this coming spring, we will actually look at doing a prescribed burn on the site. Or it could be weed eat it or whatever the case may be to basically knock back that woody vegetation. Yes, sir.
How are you approaching the issue of invasive species? There's some pernicious ones that are still on the move across the region. How does that figure into some of your planning for stopping the mowing and leaving areas undisturbed?
Well, you definitely need to monitor the areas, and if you identify those species, then whether it be spot treatment with herbicide or you might even need to go back to ground zero and take out the entire area and start over if it is something really invasive. And so yeah, we monitor the sites, and we've had a lot of non-native species coming in some areas, but luckily we haven't had any real noxious weeds. But it's really a matter of monitoring. And then
Is that a kind of staff education issue then for you? Because it's not just somebody bush hogging a couple acres, but they have to be able to recognize poison hemlock as opposed to Queen Anne's lakes or something like that.
yeah. Well, and again, at our lakes with our natural resource management staffs, most of them have the background to identify those types of situations. Less so at our locks. And even though I'm at the district office in downtown Louisville, it gives me an excuse to get out to those sites and to look at that. But then also partners. We have worked with like state fish and wildlife folks, our NRCS, natural resource conservation folks, universities. We'll utilize any help that we can get in those situations, and so far has been fairly successful. But yeah, that's a good point. Anything else? Bored you to death, or you're so excited you're ready to get out of here and start planting some native plants? Or?
The comments from the public are interesting. Have you gotten any more beyond just why does the grass look so tall? Or?
Actually, a lot of positive input. And granted, this is all being done on our own lands, typically in fairly remote areas. And so the people seeing it are visitors who have been coming for a long time. Occasionally we'll say, how come you're not mowing? Now I have to walk 20 feet to get to the water's edge, and yet we provide access to the water's edge. But usually you explain it's now pollinator habitat. We're letting things grow to improve the habitat, and explain all that, and then they'll go, oh, well, that's neat. Now that doesn't mean that'll always be the case. The way I look at a mowed lawn, I see basically a desert. Little to no benefit to anything except gophers maybe, or geese. Versus a weedy site with lots of different flowers blooming, tall grasses. To me, that's beautiful. And I know that that's providing habitat not just to pollinators, but also to songbirds and to small mammals and to reptiles and on and on. And so sometimes it's just a matter of educating about those other benefits, and that a golf course looking lawn isn't necessarily good. Now, it's not bad on the golf course, but
So I guess tying into the educational aspect.
yeah. And then sometimes just having that signage in place before someone asks resolves the situation by itself.
Do you have an estimate on the potential acreage that you could convert? Have you looked at all your maps to see?
No, because it's really not my call. Each manager manages their own site, their own project, and then we also have partners like state parks, fish and wildlife areas that are out-granted to other entities who actually manage those areas. And so we can't really direct them to do, a specific type of management. But at our lakes, I mean, we have some areas. I know last year there was a 70-acre area, an old field, converted to pollinator habitat up at Salamone in northern Indiana. And through the years, our lakes have done that just out of necessity because of, again, large areas that we used to mow, we just could not afford to continue that. And so a lot of them were converted to native grasslands that have been maintained through the years, and now they're actually interplanting with other species to diversify the makeup of those sites and provide just a more broad habitat such as for pollinators. But we still have areas, and each site manager continues to look and evaluate. In some situations, we have mowing under like a 3 to 5 year contract. And so to make a change, we would have to renegotiate the contract. And a lot of times it's easier to wait until the end of that contract period. Then we can take out an area that in the past has been mowed, hopefully reduce the cost of the contract, and then include that. And so in the future, as opportunities come up, then they are definitely looked at.
Going back to your guide to reconsider mowing,
Mm-hmm.
I think you call them SOP?
Standard operating procedure.
Okay.
Yeah. In the federal government, we have lots of acronyms.
And about how long is that document? I mean, is it a few pages or?
Yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
have 5 copies right there, which I'll give you. And so it's basically front and back, it's 2 pages. And what that is, and I know we're done time-wise, and so if you need to go, feel free to go, but it's just kind of standard mowing practices. And so really it all comes down to mow no more than 1/3 of the total given area at any one time. And so if it's a 3-acre site, this year we would only mow 1 acre of that. Then next year we'd mow another acre, and then the third year mow that other acre, but then the next year we can go back to that first site. And the reason for that is if you mow the whole thing, well, anything that's pupating within that stand, you've just eliminated. And so there's no, it basically has to start over for those insects and that sort of thing.
But you'd also have a seed bank.
Yeah.
Successive.
Well, and typically these are perennial plants, and so they're going to come back from the root system anyways. Well, for the natives. Now, this could be done just in a fescue area as well. But then, so you'll leave at least 1/3 of an area unmowed as overwintering habitat at during any winter time. And then during the growing season, you mow between July 1 and July 25. And that's particularly beneficial for monarch butterflies. They've basically already gone through our area. There's still some resident monarchs, but the milkweed is beginning to slow down in its growth. You mow it in the month of July, it begins to sprout back. Then in the fall, when the monarchs are coming back through, then they have all this fresh new sprouted milkweed to lay eggs and create new monarchs. And then during non-growing season, mow between late October and prior to March 15th. So basically in the dormant season, and that could be a way to knock woody material back. Granted, it'll sprout back, but so that's, and then there's deviations are allowable because sometimes suddenly we have a major repair. We need to mow the entire area because that's where we're going to bring in 10 million tons of sand or concrete or whatever the case may be. And then for these practices, our primary mission, say for example at our locks, is navigation. And so we can't be doing things that will interfere with that primary mission. And so we're not going to eliminate moving materials up and down the river to benefit pollinators.
So are there any other questions?
What herbicide do you use?
It depends on the site. If we're far enough away from the water, a lot of times Roundup, type of and that's one thing, being the federal government, not only do we have the state restrictions, but we have a lot of agency restrictions. And so basically, we don't apply our own herbicides. So we have to contract that out, which is expensive. And that's why we look at alternative methods, whether it be persistent tilling or if it's a small enough area, you could solarize it to kill the seed out, different things. But if your organization has certified applicators where you can do your own, then it's not quite so bad. But if it's close to water, then you wouldn't want to use, you'd want to use rodeo or something like that. Any other questions? Well, feel free to contact me if you think of something, and I appreciate your time.
Thank